When you're selecting a subject that has both curved and straight edges, and which has a high contrast to the background, sometimes the easiest way to make that selection is to use the magnetic lasso tool. So I'm going to hold down Shift and L to switch to the magnetic lasso. And you can see the cursor has a magnet attached to it, so this is also very easy to identify when you're switching among the lasso tools. You'll notice in the options bar, in addition to feather and anti-alias, we have 3 options. We have a width, contrast, and frequency option, and we also have a pressure sensitive option, which I'll turn off since I'm not using a tablet in this case. You'll see how these work together in just a second, but a quick rundown is that the width is the distance in pixels on either side of the selection line where Photoshop will look for contrast edges. And as it finds those edges, it will place anchor points to define the shape of the selection. And again, you'll see what I mean by that in just a second. The contrast value is basically like a threshold. The higher this percentage, the more Photoshop will only look for high contrast edges. It's not really a precise science as to how these things can work together, but generally you'll want to keep a medium contrast value most of the time, between about 20 and 70%. It'll just depend on your image and a little bit of experimentation. The frequency defines how rapidly the anchor points are placed along the contrast edge. So if you have an image where the contrast edges are switching from high to low contrast, you may want to make the frequency a little bit higher so that the edge doesn't divert into areas that you don't want it to. The way that people normally work with this is that if they have a higher contrast image, they'll stick with a relatively higher width, something between 10 and 20 pixels, and also they'll boost the contrast up. And what this allows them to do is to work along the edge of the subject without being overly precise and without having to zoom in too much. Now, what I like to do, whether I'm working with higher contrast or lower contrast images, is I like to zoom in a little bit and keep that width to a relatively lower value, usually something between 5 and 10 pixels. And by doing this, I know that I can keep along the edge fairly accurately without slowing down. And that sort of takes the width part out of the equation. It reduces the variability of how the selection works. From that point, I can just experiment with contrast and frequency to get the result I want. In this case, I'll leave the settings as they are. I'll place the cursor on the building edge. I'll click and release. And from that point, all I need to do is work my way along the selection edge, and Photoshop will basically snap the anchor points right into place. Now you'll notice if I move the cursor away from the edge, as I move along the edge, Photoshop is still detecting that edge and placing the anchors where they belong. So I'll continue to work my way around the building, and you'll notice at some points that maybe a small loop will occur or an anchor is placed in the wrong spot. If you do that, you can stop and then press the delete key as many times as you need to remove as many anchors as you need. From that point, you can continue to work your way around the subject until you've got as many anchors as you need to create the selection. So hopefully you can see that for high contrast images, this is a great way to make a complex selection. It just requires a little bit of experimentation with the width, contrast, and frequency. So from this point, I'll place a couple of anchor points where I would not normally do that. I'll just work my way across. And when you get to a point where you want to close out the selection, move the cursor over the original anchor point, and when the cursor shows the little circle icon, go ahead and click to create the selection.